Hello everyone, welcome back to the course Strategic Management Accounting. Topic 8, Strategizing Cost Management. As we discussed in the previous lectures, there are three interrelated domains of strategic actions: the market, organizational hierarchy, and the point of production. The market is the site in which a firm would pursue a particular positioning strategy. And then the organizational hierarchy is the site in which the organization manage and control its operations strategically in line with the strategic positioning that it tries to achieve in the market. And then when it comes to the point of production, I mentioned in the previous lectures that there are three key strategic imperatives that we have to deal with: quality, flexibility, and the cost. In the previous two lectures, we talked about quality costing and manufacturing flexibility. Now, in this lecture, our attention will be mainly on strategic cost management. So, as a learning objective, after following this lecture and after reading the recommended readings for this particular topic, you should be able to explain the nature of strategic cost management with special reference to some important calculative or rationalization techniques that the firms are now using to manage cost strategically. In a more specific sense, you should be able to understand and explain strategic cost management as an assemblage of various techniques and procedures. Now, let's talk about the strategic significance of managing cost. In other words, why should we consider cost as a strategic imperative? I would like to emphasize four key themes in this respect. The first one is the generic strategies and the value for money. As we discussed in the previous lectures, according to Michael Porter, there are two generic strategies that a firm can pursue in the market. The first one is cost leadership strategy, and second one is differentiation strategy. When it comes to cost leadership strategy, as we discussed in the previous lectures, the firm is trying to achieve a competitive advantage over its competitors by offering an acceptable product at a very low competitive price. So to achieve that low competitive price, the firm should be able to produce that product or service at a very low cost. So therefore, the firm's capacity to pursue a cost leadership strategy in the market is totally depends on the firm's capacity or the competence of managing cost strategically. If a firm can't manage its cost across its value chain, across its supply chain, then that firm has no strategic base upon which a cost leadership strategy can be followed in the market. So that is not difficult to understand. Not only that, even when it comes to differentiation strategy, cost management still play a strategic role. We know, as we discussed in our previous lectures, a differentiation strategy try to achieve a competitive advantage over the competitors by offering a superior, high quality, premium product or service to the market. So the firm is trying to offer a better product to the customers than the competitors. Therefore, the firm do have a certain freedom to charge a higher price. As we discussed in our previous lectures, generally a differentiation strategy would be a superior product, premium product, high quality product with a superior, premium or higher price. So there is that freedom to charge a higher price. However, even that higher price should be within an acceptable range in comparison to the level of quality that your product or service offers to the market. So there is a particular level of quality value that the firm offers. And in comparison to that, there is a particular range within which the firm should set its price. So still, the firm has to manage its cost to make sure that higher quality, higher value, premium value can be produced and delivered at an acceptable cost, which is a higher price anyway, but is still within the range of acceptable price. And that is what we call the value for money. From a customer's perspective, when the customers decide to buy a good or a service or a brand, they think about the value for money. As we discussed in our previous lectures, value for money means the total value package that the firm offers to the market divided by the price. The price is still the denominator. Price still determines the value for money because the value, quality wouldn't stand on its own. The value and quality would always stand upon the price that we are demanding from the customers. So that is the first theme according to which we can explain the strategic significance of cost, generic strategies and the value for money. Then second theme is the saturating, low-growing nature of the contemporary globalized markets. As we discussed in our previous lecture, the contemporary competitive conditions are neoliberalized, globalized, virtualized, and digitalized. So with all these dynamics, market has become a highly competitive, intensely competitive site. So in this contemporary markets, the freedom of the firm or the opportunities of the firm to manipulate prices becoming low. The firm can't anymore keep on increasing the prices to sustain a healthy profit margin. The prices are becoming very difficult to manipulate because the competition is so tensed. So in such a market where the price manipulation to sustain a healthy profit margin become increasingly difficult, the managerial attention need to be on the cost. So the cost management becomes the primary mean through which a sustainable profit margin can be achieved. When the price is stagnating, price is becoming something difficult to manipulate, price is becoming something very, very difficult to increase anymore, the cost become the ultimate mean through which a sustainable profit margin can be maintained. So that is our second point, the nature of the competitive market today. And thirdly, ever increasing overheads. As we know, in this neoliberal world, companies has to deal with various global themes, such as, for example, sustainability, global governance, regulations, diversity, and so on. The firms has to make sure that firms comply with various global regulatory and governance codes. And this means lots of expenditures. The firms has to have various officers, departments and so on to deal with, for example, health and safety, sustainability, accreditations and so on. And not only that, firms has to invest heavily on research and development. The continuous growing investment on research and development is one of the fundamental means through which the firm can maintain its competitiveness in the market. Nowadays, running a firm means huge overhead expenditures. So if a firm can't manage these overhead expenditures effectively, then the firm's capacity to be competitive in the market, the firm's capacity to achieve a competitive advantage in the market is very, very minimal. So that is the third reason for cost being a strategic imperative, ever increasing overhead expenditures. And finally, as a aggregation of all these 3 points, when a firm is able to manage its cost effectively, when the firm is very good in managing its cost effectively, that firm can free cash flows for further investment and reinvestment in the firm. So the cost reduction, cost savings would become one of the key means of financing the firm's further expansions, especially when the stock markets are becoming highly competitive, saturating, when the possibilities of bringing more finance, money into the firm through stock markets becoming really, really difficult, the cost savings become one of the key means through which money can be found for the reinvestments. So those are the 4 key themes according to which we can explain the strategic significance of cost. The generic strategies and the value for money, the competitive nature of the contemporary market in which price manipulation becomes very difficult. And thirdly, ever increasing overheads, the burden of overheads. And finally, the possibilities of creating free cash flows for further investment through cost management. One of the key points that I have to emphasize is that strategic cost management is not a singular technique, concept, or process of managing cost. Instead, strategic cost management should be understood, conceptualized, and discussed as an assemblage of various concepts, techniques, and procedures. And this assemblage can be explained and discussed under 6 interrelated themes. The first one is the reduction of process and the product wastages and inefficiencies. So here we will concentrate and discuss how various techniques, concepts, and procedures are used to reduce the product and the process related inefficiencies and wastages, especially inventory management, waste management, and quality management. And second element is the labor cost, reduction of labor cost. Here we will talk about various new concepts, techniques, and procedures through which the firms are now trying to achieve lower labor cost. And then third element or theme is management of cost across the value chain and the supply chain. So we will talk about various techniques, processes, and concepts that would be useful in managing the value chain and in managing the supply chain and accordingly reducing the cost associated with various activities of value chain and supply chain. And fourthly, overhead management and costing. So as we discussed earlier, the overhead has become one of the key dominating challenge for the contemporary organizations. So here we will talk about how activity-based costing and activity-based management is specifically used now to manage overhead strategically. And then the fifth element or theme is the capacity optimization. Here we will be talking about how techniques such as throughput accounting, the theory of constraint can be used to optimize the capacity and thereby to reduce the cost. And finally, planning, control, and coordination. How the techniques such as enterprise resource planning, balanced scorecard are used to coordinate control and manage the activities across various departments, divisions, and processes within the value chain as well as across the supply chain. So those are the key themes or key elements according to which the strategic cost management can be explained. And as you will understand, most of the concepts, techniques, and procedures we will cover under each of these 6 themes are what we have already discussed in our previous lectures. So therefore, this strategic cost management lecture would be a revisit and a reflection of what we discussed previously in the previous lectures. When it comes to the reduction of product and process wastages and inefficiencies, there are 3 key themes that the contemporary management concentrates on. The first one is inventory management. Nowadays, managers think that inventory is a wastage. Inventory is an inefficiency. That is because holding inventories incur holding cost. It requires very valuable space. It requires various managerial effort and labor to protect the inventories. So therefore, the ideal point, the optimum point regarding the inventory management is not to have any inventories. If a company can run their production process, if the company can continue with their day-to-day operations without having any inventories, stocks, then it is the ideal. So that is what the companies are now trying to implement. So we call that just-in-time manufacturing or just-in-time inventory management. So in that case, goods and services or the components, raw materials and so on are reaching the point of production only when it is necessary. So only when a certain component is necessary for production, they will be ordered and they will reach that particular point. So that is just-in-time manufacturing. So no inventory is held. But in order to achieve that kind of a production system, as we discussed in our previous lecture, manufacturing flexibility, we need flexible machines. When a company has flexible machines, there are more opportunities for the company to reduce the resetting time and the resetting cost of machines. When the resetting time and cost is reduced down to zero, as in the case of a photocopy machine we discussed in our previous lecture, then the reorder quantity or the economic order quantity or the economic production quantity can be reduced down to 1. That basically means we will order or we will produce a particular component or a raw material or any item only when it is necessary, because the economic batch quantity is just 1. So in order to manage inventory as just-in-time inventory management, we need to reduce machine resetting time and cost so that we can reach the reorder quantity, economic quantity or the economic production quantity down to 1. And to do that, not only the flexible machines, you need production smoothing or line balancing. That basically means various stages or various processes in the production line should be balanced. For example, if there are, there are 2 production units here. The production unit A receives the component from the production unit B. So the output rate of the production unit B should be equal to the input rate of production unit A. So the input, throughput and output of all these units, interconnected units, should be balanced. So that's what we call production smoothing and line balancing. So to do that, you need a proper information system. an information system through which each unit, each phase, or each stage of the production line can communicate with the other stages, other units effectively, so that they know what is to be released, when it is to be released, what is to be received, and when it is to be received. So that's what you call a proper information system. Originally, the Japanese manufacturing companies created this type of information flow using what they call a Kanban system. So you can have a further understanding about these specific techniques such as just-in-time, reduction of setup time, flexible machines, Kanban system, and so on when you read the recommended readings. Then the second theme related to reduction of wastage and inefficiencies is the reduction of the defective rates. That is basically quality costing and quality management, which we discussed in our previous lecture. So here the attention is to reduce the defective rate. In other words, to enhance the quality of the production system. So when you enhance the quality of the production system, or in other words, when you reduce the defective rate, the internal failure cost, external failure cost will be minimized. And also, through the continuous improvement, as we discussed in our previous lecture, you can further reduce the appraisal cost and the prevention cost. So the total quality management and quality costing is a very key element in strategic cost management. And then thirdly, reduction of wastage and inefficiencies also involves a careful assessment and redesign of production processes. That is because the production process, the value chain, might have certain activities which are duplicated, might have certain activities which are not necessary, might have certain activities which are taking time too much. There may be certain activities which operate as a bottleneck for the other activities. So we have to reduce that kind of process inefficiencies. So for that end, periodically, the companies would carry out what they call a business process re-engineering or redesign exercises. They would carefully review each and every activity involved in the value chain in order to reduce the duplications, inefficiencies, unnecessary activities, too much time-taking activities, and so on. So that's the third element coming under the reduction of waste and inefficiencies. So, in a broader sense, reduction of process and the product wastages and inefficiencies is one of the key elements of strategic cost management. So in this regard, there are three key managerial themes that the companies are dealing with: inventory management, quality management, and the business process re-engineering. The reduction of labor cost is the second key theme of strategic cost management. We discussed this aspect in our previous lecture under manufacturing flexibility, especially the flexible labor. So as we discussed there, this involves quite a few concepts, techniques, and procedures. And one of them is what we call flexing the job or de-skilling. So de-skilling a job basically means redesigning the job, often with the help of flexible machines, dividing the job into small tiny pieces so that even an unskilled worker can carry out those jobs. Therefore, jobs which were previously considered to be skilled work, which were needing skilled labor, now can be carried out by unskilled laborers. So previously, We needed to have a particular worker with a special skill so that we have to pay a high wage rate for that particular component or element or type of labor. Now, once the job is de-skilled, once the job is divided into small tiny pieces with the help of flexible machines, that particular job can be carried out by a set of unskilled workers for whom we now can pay very low wage rate. And such unskilled laborers can be easily found in the peripheral nations with a very low wage rate. So therefore, such work, de-skilled work, now can be outsourced to various peripheral nations such as Sri Lanka, India, Bangladesh, Vietnam, Taiwan, China, and so on. So that is one of the popular method that the companies are now adopting to reduce the labor cost. De-skill the job so that even an unskilled worker can carry out that work, and then that work could be outsourced into the peripheral economies where the wage rates are very, very low. And then we also talk about flexing the time. In the contemporary world, the operations are carried out 24 hours under various shifts. So the machines and the production plant are running without a stop throughout the day. And the labor is occupied in different shifts. And these shift work patterns have created a situation where the overtime payments are reduced to the possible minimum. So that is what we call flexing the time, shift work. And similarly, we also discussed in the previous lectures that flexing the contractual obligations can reduce the cost. So this basically involves a 0-hour contract. So labor is occupied if and only if the labor is needed. So only the productive hours are paid. Only the occupied hours are paid. There are no any idle hours for the company. All idle hours are the cost of the laborer, not for the company. So the wastages or the inefficiencies of idle hours are now shifted to the laborer. They are not borne by, they are not captured by the company itself. And then flexing the space. The companies are now increasingly creating a different work arrangements, work contracts, so that the laborers can be shifted from one place to another place very easily with a minimum cost. And also we talk about immaterialization of labor. That means the hard labor was reduced and the laborers are demanded and asked or given opportunities to carry out more symbolic, analytical, and communicative labor. So this is mainly facilitated by flexible machines. So the certain activities previously carried out by management with a high labor rate or wage rate are now incorporated into the laboring itself, the lower level work itself. So they are carried out by the lower level workers with a low wage rate as a part of their hard labor with the help of flexible machines. And also we talk about how activity-driven management can reduce the cost. Rather than managing the labor as a category, now the managerial attention is paid on to the specific activities that the laborers carry out. So that helps the reduction of cost through activity-based costing and activity-based management. So these are some examples through which the labor cost can be reduced. So when you look at these particular specific techniques, processes and procedures through which the labor cost is reduced, you can easily understand, as we explained in the previous lecture, the reduction of labor cost or the flexible labor is the most politically sensitive dimension of contemporary management. That is because this flexible labor has huge implication on the lives of the laborers. Value chain management and the supply chain management is the third theme or element of strategic cost management. So this involves attempts of reducing the cost by managing the value chain and the supply chain. And this can involve so many different techniques, procedures, and concepts. However, I would like to take your attention to three key aspects here. The first one is the notion or the idea of value engineering or value management. The concept of value has a very specific meaning in this context of value engineering or value management. The value is defined by this particular formula. So the value is functionality divided by cost. In this equation, the functionality means the specific objective or specific task that a specific center, an activity, or a stage or a unit of production has to carry out. For example, think about that there is a particular point in the production line where the quality inspections are carried out. So the quality inspection needs the particular functionality to be carried out. So when it comes to the value engineering, therefore the fundamental question is, can we enhance the manner in which the quality inspection is carried out? Can we enhance the volume of quality inspection per hour? Can we increase the efficiency with which these quality inspections are carried out? Can we increase the accuracy of the quality inspections, and so on? So the value engineering pay attention on the one hand to the volume, efficiency, and the accuracy of the manner in which the particular functionality is achieved. And at the same time, while enhancing the volume, efficiency, and the accuracy of the functionality, the managers has to think about the manners in which the cost has to be reduced. So this functionality is achieved at what cost? So that basically means continuously management has to think and rethink about how to reduce the labor hours consumed by this functionality, how to reduce the materials consumed by this functionality, how to reduce other overhead expenses absorbed by this particular functionality. So that's what you mean by value engineering or value management. So considering or thinking about the production centers, unit, entities in terms of the specific functionalities that particular unit, entity or point or activities has to carry out. And then thinking about that functionality in terms of the amount of material, labor and overhead expenses that we have to spend to carry out that functionality. So in that way, so you try to re-engineer, manage this functionality with lower consumption of resources. That's what we call value engineering. So value chain management involves what we call value engineering. And secondly, one of the key managerial concept or a technique or a procedure or a system is target costing. Target costing is very well discussed techniques which comes under strategic cost management. And I don't have to explain it here because we already dealt with this particular concept in our third lecture. So I would ask you to go back to the third lecture and listen to that one again and read the recommended material to see how target costing can be considered as a strategic cost management technique. And then thirdly, we have supply chain management. So supply chain management involves coordination and integration between various parties involved in the supply chain. So basically this involves management of the flow of raw material, work in progress, and other type of components from the suppliers to the production facilities. So this involves various kind of techniques such as enterprise resource planning, logistic management, transport management, and online tracking of the movement of goods and so on. And it is a huge area to discuss. And supply chain management is a huge big discipline where one can do a total master's degree on supply chain management. So therefore, in this particular lecture, we can't cover everything about supply chain management. So basically, a simple understanding that supply chain management is one of the key component of strategic cost management is sufficient for this particular course. So in a broader sense, strategic cost management involves reduction of cost by managing the value chain and the supply chain. In this respect, there can be many techniques, but three key techniques are important. One, value engineering, target costing, and thirdly, supply chain management. Management of overhead expenses is the fourth key dimension of strategic cost management. As we discussed earlier, overhead has become one of the largest elements of the total cost structure of a company today. Companies today have to deal with various regulatory, governance, and infrastructural themes. For example, sustainability, health and safety, diversity, and so on. So these theme management, infrastructural elements, regulatory elements, governance elements cost a lot, and they have increased the amount of overhead expenditures that the companies have to spend today. So in that sense, the management of overhead is one of the critical elements of strategic cost management. And when it comes to the management of overhead, one of the key themes is activity-based costing and activity-based management. Activity-based costing and activity-based management has provided a new philosophy, a new conception of cost management and costing. So as illustrated in this diagram, when we think about cost through activities, we can have two supplementary views, two supplementary angles on the management of cost and the costing of cost. The first one is the cost assignment view or costing view, which is the vertical angle in this diagram. So the costing view or the costing angle is basically associated with calculating or estimating the cost of a given cost unit, a product or a service. So the challenge there is to absorb or allocate or trace overheads into the cost units. So it starts with the conventional understanding of cost. In other words, resources or resource categories or the cost categories. As we know, in a conventional sense, cost and resource are categorized into categories of material, that means direct material and indirect material, labor, that means indirect labor and direct labor, and expenses, that means direct expenses and indirect expenses. So we have variable cost and the fixed cost. We have direct cost and indirect cost. So in a conventional sense, such costs were absorbed into the cost unit using overhead absorption methods, such as prime labor cost or direct material cost and so on. The activity-based costing provides a different angle. So the activity-based costing understand that all these cost categories, all these cost items are incurred because of a particular set of activities to be carried out. So activities are considered to be the ultimate cost driver. So therefore, the cost assignment view or the activity-based costing reclassify these conventional cost categories into activity cost pools. So there is a set of activities, and for each activity, these are the material to be consumed, labor to be consumed, and other expenses to be consumed. So we have activity-based cost pools. And then such activity-based cost categories or cost pools are traced to the cost objects on the basis of activities involved. So therefore, a particular cost object is costed on the basis of the number of and the nature of the activities involved in producing and delivering that particular cost object. So here is the cost object A. To produce that cost object A, we have to carry out these activities, laboring, machining, and so on. And these activities involves this much of labor, this much of material, and this much of expenses, and so on. So you trace or absorb the cost to the cost unit on the basis of the activities involved in that particular cost unit. So that is what we call the assignment view. The objective of the assignment view is to calculate or estimate the cost of a cost unit. It is a costing exercise. It is the costing angle. Then, when you think about this diagram horizontally, you see the management or the process view. That is the activity-based management. So in that particular process view, we understand cost drivers are the activities. It is the activities which drives the cost. We consume labor, material, and other expenses in order to carry out a particular set of activities. So the cost drivers are connected to the activities. So therefore, if we want to manage the cost, what we have to manage is the activities. The cost can be better managed by managing the activities. So therefore, for each category of activities or for each activity, we have to set specific key performance indicators. And by achieving that key performance indicators attributed to activities, then we can better manage cost. So that is what you call activity-based management. And finally, in order to set that kind of a key performance indicators for each activity or activity type, we have to carry out various kind of managerial analysis. These include, for example, activity analysis, cost drive analysis, value chain analysis, and the performance analysis. So this diagram summarizes the manner in which overhead is reconceptualized through activity-based costing and activity-based management. So the activity-based costing and activity-based management is one of the very popular technique the companies nowadays use to control and manage overheads. By using activity-based costing and activity-based management, various cost categories which were conventionally understood as fixed cost now can be understood as variable cost. The large majority of the fixed cost, according to the conventional view, is now reclassified as variable cost. When you see them as variable cost, the controllability, manageability increases. So you understand a particular manner in which specific cost elements can be now connected to the production volumes through activities. So that is what activity-based costing and activity-based management did. Basically, reconceptualizing the overheads on the basis of activities, and by doing that, transforming fixed cost into variable cost. Therefore, the controllability of the overhead is enhanced. Capacity optimization is the fifth element of strategic cost management. Production engineers and the production managers can talk about so many different techniques, procedures, and concepts through which capacity can be optimized. However, when it comes to strategic management accounting, in the recent past, there's a particular idea which is popularized. That is the idea of theory of constraint and throughput accounting. In a broader sense, theory of constraint and throughput accounting is a glorification of conventional limiting factor analysis and a simplification of linear programming. And this idea of theory of constraint and throughput accounting was initially introduced by a fictional story, a novel written by Goldratt and Cox. The goal, excellence in manufacturing. So this was a fictional story of a particular manufacturer, an entrepreneur. So this manufacturer has a problem of capacity optimization. So he calls upon one of his good friends, a university professor, to help him. And this university professor comes and provides a particular activity cycle or analytical cycle through which capacity can be optimized. And also, he suggests a particular set of calculations, accounting ratios through which the capacity optimization can be measured, evaluated, and judged. So, in a broader sense, therefore, theory of constraint and throughput accounting involves two key elements. The first one is a particular cycle of managerial analysis through which capacity can be optimized. And secondly, a particular set of calculations, ratios through which the capacity optimization can be measured, assessed, and judged. So when it comes to the cycle of capacity optimization, very similar to the conventional limiting factor analysis, in the same manner as in the case of conventional limiting factor analysis, the theory of constraint and throughput accounting recognizes that it is a particular constraint or a limiting factor which would constrain the total system capacity. So in other words, there should be a specific limiting factor or a constraint or a bottleneck which limit the total production capacity. Therefore, the capacity optimization should concentrate on that particular limiting factor or bottleneck or that constraint. So in that sense, the cycle of capacity optimization starts with the step number one, which is identifying the constraint in the system. That is the first step. Identify which is the factor or what is the specific factor, resource or the activity which constrained the total capacity, which operate as a bottleneck. So once you identify that particular factor, then the second step is finding the ways of exploiting it to the maximum possible. What are the specific managerial steps, techniques you can use to exploit that capacity constraint, that bottleneck to the maximum possibilities? And then thirdly, subordinate and synchronize every other activities, everything else in the system to this bottleneck or the constraint. That is because when a particular factor is constrained in the production system, when a particular factor is operating as the bottleneck, there is no point spending money on all other activities beyond the volume permitted by the bottleneck. If the bottleneck is permitting a particular level of production, spending money on other activities to enhance the volume wouldn't work. That would be an utter waste of money. Therefore, synchronize and subordinate all other activities to the bottleneck. And once that is done, then you have to think about ways and means of elevating the capacity of the bottleneck. Is there a specific way you can enhance the bottleneck capacity? So you have to think about investing on the bottleneck and increase the bottleneck capacity, because that will increase the total production capacity. And once you do that, you have to revisit the cycle again. That is the step number 5. Repeat it. Identify the bottleneck again. Is it the same factor now working as the bottleneck or something else? If there is something else, how do we maximize its use? And how do we elevate it to a different level? How do we subordinate everything else to that particular bottleneck and repeat the cycle? So that is the first element of theory of constraint and throughput accounting. A particular cycle of analysis through which capacity can be optimized. Then, Gottlieb and Cox introduces 3 key accounting ratios to measure, to evaluate, and to judge the capacity optimization. And these ratios are based upon a particular idea of throughput. So here, the concept of throughput is very similar to the conventional idea of contribution. So in conventional limiting factor analysis, in conventional linear programming, and in conventional management accounting, we have an idea called or concept called contribution. The contribution is revenue minus variable cost. So here, in the theory of constraint and throughput accounting, we have a very similar idea and we call it throughput. Throughput is defined as revenue minus the material cost. Not the variable cost, but only the material cost. That is because in theory of constraint and throughput accounting, we are dealing with a very short-term time span, an hour, a day, or a week, a particular production cycle. So in that very short-term time span, it is only the material, very often variable. Labor is going to be fixed. So the only thing that you can change is the materials. So therefore you consider only material in calculating throughput. So the throughput is revenue minus material cost because we are dealing with a very short-term time period in which only the material is controllable and variable. So that is the concept of throughput. Then once you calculate the throughput of a particular bottleneck or a particular process or a unit, then we can calculate 3 interrelated ratios. The first one is called throughput per factory hour. So you calculated that by using this particular ratio. So throughput or return per factory hour is throughput per unit divided by the product's time on the bottleneck resources. How much resources or how many hours is spent on that particular bottleneck factor. So that is what we call throughput or return per factory hour. And that's the first accounting ratio you calculate in throughput accounting. And second ratio is called cost per factory hour. So for that you use the formula of total factory cost divided by total time available on the bottleneck resources. So that's the second ratio. And then the third ratio is basically an aggregation, a combination of the first 2 ratios. You divide the first ratio by the second ratio to get the third ratio, which we call throughput accounting ratio. So that's the 3 key ratios that we use in throughput accounting. So in a broader sense, theory of constraint and throughput accounting is, in a way, a glorification of limiting factor analysis and a simplification of linear programming. And throughput accounting include 2 key elements: a particular managerial cycle through which capacity can be optimized, and then a set of accounting ratios through which the capacity optimization can be calculated, assessed, and judged. So that is one of the popular concept, idea in strategic management accounting relevant to capacity optimization. Sixth, or the last element of our strategic cost management framework is the enterprise level planning, coordination, and control. For that end, companies can use many different techniques. For example, companies can use, in a conventional sense, budgeting, or even the companies can use balanced scorecard. However, one of the most comprehensive and increasingly becoming popular is the enterprise resource planning or ERP systems. ERP system is a software packages and integrated software packages which integrate various modules or systems through which the enterprises are managed. An ERP system integrate various dimensions, aspects of functionalities of managing a company as a totality. So therefore, an ERP system may include human resource management or the HRM package, or it can include accounting packages. It can include certain financial decision making packages, and it can include even certain strategic management packages, including a balanced scorecard element, and it can include logistics, supply chain management elements, and so on. So, in a broader sense, ERP is a comprehensive management information system which integrate various aspects and elements of managing the enterprise as a totality. And nowadays, such ERP systems are operating virtually on cloud-based platforms. And such ERP systems immensely facilitate monitoring, coordinating, and controlling various activities across the organization. And by doing that, it can significantly reduce the operational cost of the organization. So the ERP is one of the key techniques through which cost is managed strategically today. And given the scope of this particular course, we don't have to have a detailed understanding of ERP systems, but generic understanding of the fact that ERP now plays a critical or a strategic role in managing the cost is sufficient. With that, we have now reached the end of this lecture. So, as usual, I will summarize what we discussed in this lecture before ending the lecture. So, as we discussed in the previous lectures, we now know there are three interrelated domains or sites of strategic actions in which strategies can be enabled and enacted: the market, organizational hierarchy, and the point of production. When it comes to the point of production, there are three key strategic imperatives that a company has to deal with: quality, flexibility, and the cost. The cost has to be managed strategically. A cost is one of the key, perhaps the most important strategic imperative. And when we are trying to understand strategic cost management, we have to pay attention to six interrelated themes. So these six themes would be useful in understanding and explaining strategic cost management. The first one is the reduction of process and the product wastages and inefficiencies. In that respect, we discussed the role that quality management, especially the reduction of defective rate, can play. And also we talk about the role that inventory management, especially the JIT, just in time manufacturing system can play. And thirdly, we also discussed the role that business process reengineering, the business process redesigning can play. So that is the first dimension. Reduction of process and the product wastages and inefficiencies through dropping the defective rate by dropping or reducing the inventory levels and by eliminating various inefficiencies related to the value chain. And secondly, we talked about the reduction of labor cost. That is, in a broader sense, creating flexible labor. And thirdly, we talk about reducing the cost across the value chain and supply chain management. In that case, we paid special attention to the notion called value engineering or value management. In that case, we defined the value as the functionality divided by the cost. So in engineering or managing the value in the value chain, the managers has to pay attention to the enhancement of the functionalities as well as the reduction of the resource consumption by the production of that functionality. And then fourthly, we talk about overhead costing and management. So we talked about the role that activity-based costing and activity-based management can play. And fifth, the capacity optimization. So when it comes to capacity optimization, we discussed theory of constraint and throughput accounting. Especially two elements of these theory of constraint and throughput accounting. The cycle of managerial activities through which the capacity can be optimized and a specific set of accounting ratios through which capacity optimization can be calculated, measured, and evaluated. And finally, we talked about the enterprise level planning, control, and coordination. So in that case, we paid our special attention to enterprise resource planning systems. So thank you very much for listening to this lecture and see you again in the next lecture.